We can now bring in Reporters Without Borders spokesperson Pauline Ades-Mevel. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Another journalist killed while doing their job in the West Bank. Your reaction?
We deplore this death, and of course it's another journalist, as you said, at a time when we deplore more and more deaths, especially in Ukraine. What is striking with this killing, or what appears to be a killing this morning, is that it constitutes a serious breach of the Geneva Convention, as well as Resolution 2222 of the UN Security Council on the protection of journalists. As your journalist was saying, she was wearing a jacket and identified as a journalist on the field. So it's very important that not only there is an investigation, but an independent international investigation must be launched on this case. And at Reporters Without Borders, we believe that the joint investigation that is proposed by the Israeli authorities is not the good solution to investigate this case.
I wanted to ask you about that because, as you mentioned, you touched on there, Israel has proposed a joint investigation with the Palestinians. Your thoughts on that? Should it not be an outside independent investigation?
Clearly, because just to make sure that there is no partiality, and as we can see since this morning, the Israeli authorities have raised the potentiality of gunfire from opponents. So it's very absolutely important that there is an independent investigation with no partiality that will bring the truth and those responsible to justice. Those involved, those we don't know exactly what has happened, and the investigation is needed. But in order for not to to avoid impunity, it is very important that this investigation is independent. It will send a very clear signal to those concerned, to Al Jazeera, to her family, to her friends, to all her colleagues. As you said, she was an icon, she was renowned and very much seen and famous in the world of journalists and had been for a long time.
We would need permission, clearly, for an independent investigation. Will Israel grant that?
Well, I mean, it's the role of the international community and the UN to convince, to make sure that international investigation can be led on the case. It is very important to clarify what has happened. There are different versions, and what will come out from this investigation will be extremely helpful. Also, in terms of safety of journalists, it is very, very important to recall that this particular place in Cisjordania, the occupied territories, are extremely dangerous for journalists, and they need to be protected. They cover to bring information, and it's essential that we understand what has happened.
And I think about, other journalists that have been killed. You touched on Ukraine, but I'm also thinking about last year in Afghanistan when Indian photographer Dani Siddiqui was captured by the Taliban and killed in apparent crossfire. His parents alleged that he was actually tortured by the Taliban, even though he was wearing that flak jacket, which journalists, sort of identified journalists, and that they're not supposed to be touched.
Well, it is very important to understand Danish Siddiqui from Reuters that you mentioned was also a renowned journalist. He was killed in Afghanistan, and it was a huge shock among the community of journalists as well. The violence he may have been submitted to also. Each time there are some vague or blur zones, it contributes to bring more impunity. It is really essential, and that's what we fight for at Reporters Without Borders: the end of impunity, the clarification, and make sure that those responsible are brought to justice. It sends a very, very strong signal to those who commit crimes, not only in war zone or in Jenin, but all those who think that killing a journalist is not important and won't have consequences.
Well, hopefully we do get answers to this horrific crime. Thank you very much for that, Pauline Ades-Mevel.